by Robert Harris. Cleverly called a meeting of his junior private secretaries in his office at 9 p.m. sharp. They trooped in together, Leggett, Sears, Miss Watson, and stood in a line while he perched on the edge of his desk. They were braced for what Sears liked to call his staff officer visits the trenches speech. "Thank you all for your efforts today. I know how hectic it's been. Even so, I need to ask everyone to be on parade again tomorrow morning by 7:30. I want to be sure we're all here to give the PM a rousing send-off. He'll leave number 10 for the drive to Heston Aerodrome at 7:45. 2 aircraft will be making the trip to Munich." He picked up a sheaf of papers. "It's been decided that on the first plane will be the PM, Sir Horace Wilson, Lord Dunglass, and 3 officials from the Foreign Office, William Strang, Frank Ashton Watkin, and Sir William Melkin. We've also been instructed to send someone from the private office." He turned to Sears. "Cecil, I'd like it to be you." Sears' head rocked back slightly in surprise. "Really, sir?" He looked at Leggett, who promptly stared at his shoes. He felt nothing but relief. "I suggest you pack on the assumption you'll be staying for up to 3 nights. The Germans are arranging hotel rooms. On the second plane will be 2 detectives for the PM's protection, and the PM's doctor, and 2 girls from the garden room. Each plane has space for 14 passengers. So if one of them develops any mechanical problems, everyone can transfer to the other." Sears raised his hand. "I appreciate the honour, sir, but wouldn't Hugh be a better choice? His German's 10 times better than mine." "I've made my decision. Leggett will stay here with Miss Watson and deal with correspondence. We have telegrams of congratulation to answer from most every leader in the world, let alone the thousands of letters from members of the public. If we don't make a start on it soon, we will never get to the top of it. All right?" He looked along the line. "Good. Thank you all. I shall see you in the morning." Once they were back in the corridor, Sears beckoned Leggett into his office. "I'm sorry about this, Hugh. It's absolutely bloody ridiculous." "Really, don't give it another thought. You're senior to me." "Yes, but you're the German expert, for God's sake. You were in Vienna when I was still in the Dominions office." "Honestly, it's fine." Leggett was so touched by his concern he felt he should try to alleviate it. "To be perfectly frank, between you and me, I'm relieved not to be going." "Why on earth wouldn't you want to go? Don't you want to see Hitler in the flesh? Something to tell the grandchildren?" "Well, actually, that's just it. I've already seen Hitler in the flesh, in Munich, as a matter of fact, 6 months before he came to power. I can assure you once was quite enough." "You've never mentioned that before. What happened? Did you go to a Nazi rally?" "No, I didn't hear him speak." Suddenly Leggett wished he'd never brought the subject up, but Sears was so insistent on hearing more he couldn't really leave it at that. "It was only on the street one day, outside his apartment building to be exact. We ended up being chased off by his brown shirts." He closed his eyes briefly, as he always did when he thought of it. "I'd only just left Oxford, so I suppose I could at least plead youth as an excuse. Anyway, enjoy Munich, assuming you get a chance to see it." He escaped into the corridor. Sears called after him. "Thanks, Hugh. I'll give your regards to the Führer." Back in his own office, Miss Watson was putting on her coat to go home. Nobody knew where she lived. Leggett guessed she must be lonely, but she rebuffed all invitations. "Oh, there you are," she said irritably. "I was just about to write you a note. Sir Alexander Cadogan's secretary called for you. He wants to see you right away." Workmen, lit by floodlights, were laying sandbags outside the entrance to the Foreign Office. Leggett found the sight mildly disturbing. Apparently nobody had bothered to tell the Ministry of Works that the Sudeten crisis was supposed to be over. Cadogan's outer office was deserted, the door to his inner sanctum slightly ajar. When Leggett knocked, the permanent Under-Secretary appeared in person, smoking a cigarette. "Ah, Leggett, come in." He was not alone. Seated on the leather sofa at the far end of a cavernous room was a man of about 50, saturnine, elegant, with a thick moustache and deep-set, staring dark eyes. Cadogan said, "This is Colonel Mingus. I asked him to look at the document you brought in last night. You'd best have done." A colonel wearing a Savile Row suit in Whitehall, thought Leggett. That could only mean the Secret Intelligence Service. The armchair matched the sofa. Hard, brown, scuffed, exquisitely uncomfortable. Cadogan took its twin. He reached up and turned on a tasselled standard lamp. It too looks as if it might have been borrowed from some baronial Scottish castle. A grimy ochre light suffused their corner of the office. "Colonel?" On the low table in front of Mingus was a thick manila folder. He opened it and took out the document that had been put through Leggett's door. "Well, the first thing to say is it's genuine, as far as we can tell." He spoke in a friendly Etonian drawl that immediately put Leggett on his guard. "It ties in with everything we've been hearing from various opposition figures in Germany since the beginning of the summer. But this is the first time they've produced actual written evidence." "I gather from Alex you've no idea why it should have come to you." "That's right." "Well, they're a disparate lot, must be said. A handful of diplomats, a landowner or two, an industrialist. Half of them don't seem to be aware of the existence of the other half. The only thing they all seem to agree on is they expect the British Empire to go to war to restore the Kaiser, or at any rate his family, which, considering we lost the best part of 1,000,000 men getting rid of the bugger less than 20 years ago, betrays a certain political naivety, to put it mildly. They say they have support within the army, but frankly, apart from a few disaffected Prussians at the top, we're not convinced. Your chap, on the other hand, sounds as if he might be a bit more interesting." "My chap?" The colonel consulted his folder. "I assume the name Paul von Hartmann is not unknown to you." So that was it. It had happened at last. The file looked intimidatingly extensive. Leggett could see no point in evasion. "Yes, of course. We were at Balliol together. He was a Rhodes Scholar. You think he is the one who delivered the document?" "Sent it rather than delivered it. He's in Germany." "When did you last see him?" Leggett pretended to think. 6 years ago, the summer of 32. "You've not been in contact since?" "No." "Do you mind if I ask why not?" "No specific reason. We simply drifted apart." "Whereabouts did you last see him?" "In Munich." "Munich? Really?" "Suddenly all roads seem to lead to Munich." He smiled, but his eyes bored into Leggett's. "Do you mind if I ask what you were doing there?" "I was on holiday, a walking holiday in Bavaria at the end of finals." "On holiday with von Hartmann?" "Among others." "And you haven't communicated since, not even a letter?" "That's right." "Well then, forgive me. It doesn't sound as if you drifted apart so much as had a blazing row." Leggett took his time before replying. "It's true we had some political differences. In Oxford they didn't seem to matter so much, but this was Germany in July, in the middle of a general election campaign. You couldn't escape politics at that time, especially in Munich." "So your friend was a Nazi?" "No. If anything, he considered himself a socialist, but he was also German nationalist, and that's what led to the arguments." Cadogan cut in. "A National Socialist, then, but lowercase, perhaps, rather than upper." "You're smiling, as if I've said something droll." "Forgive me, Sir Alex, but that is what Paul would have called a classic piece of English sophistry." For a moment he thought he might have gone too far, but then Cadogan's mouth twitched down slightly, which was his way of registering amusement. "Yes, fair enough. I suppose he would have had a point." "Did you know that Hartmann had entered the German diplomatic service?" "I did hear his name mentioned in a connection by mutual friends from Oxford. I wasn't surprised. It was always his intention. His grandfather was an ambassador under Bismarck." "Did you know he'd also joined the Nazi Party?" "No, but again it makes sense, given his belief in a greater Germany." "We're sorry to have to ask you all these questions, Leggett, but the situation has arisen and we need to understand precisely what sort of relationship you have, or had, with this particular German." The colonel put down the folder. It occurred to Leggett that most of it probably had nothing to do with him, that it was merely a trick to fool him into thinking they knew far more than they did. "It seems your former friend Hartmann is now working with the opposition to Hitler. His position inside the Foreign Ministry has given him access to secret material which he is willing to share with us, or more specifically, willing to share with you. How do you feel about that?" "Surprised." "But willing in principle to take matters further?" "In what sense?" Cadogan said, "Willing to go to Munich tomorrow and meet with your old friend." "Good heavens!" Leggett had not been expecting that. He's going to be in Munich? Apparently, yes. One member of the German opposition whom I do take seriously has been in touch with us this evening, via a secret channel, to ask if we can arrange for you to travel to Munich as part of the PM's party. In return, they will try to make sure Hartmann is included in the German delegation. It appears Hartmann has another document in his possession, more important than the one you received last night. He has some mad notion of handing it to the Prime Minister personally, which obviously cannot be allowed to happen. However, he will give it to you. We'd very much like to know what it is. Therefore we think you should go and meet him. I'm utterly astonished. It's not without risk, warned Cadogan. Technically, at least, it will be an act of espionage on foreign soil. We wouldn't want to mislead you about that. Yes, but on the other hand, it's hard to believe the Germans would seek to embarrass His Majesty's government with a spying scandal in the middle of an international conference. Are you sure about that? Cadogan shook his head. With Hitler, anything's possible. The last thing he wants to do tomorrow is sit down with the PM and Daladier. I suspect he's perfectly capable of seizing on exactly such an incident as an excuse to break off negotiations. He turned to Leggett. So you'll need to consider it carefully. The stakes are high. And there's another point. We think it best if the Prime Minister knows nothing about this. Do you mind if I ask why? Often in these delicate matters it's better for politicians not to know the full details. You mean in case something goes wrong? No, said Cadogan. Rather because the PM is already under the most immense strain, and it's our duty as public servants to do everything we can not to add to it. Leggett made one last feeble attempt to escape. You do know that Oscar Cleverley has already told Cecil Sears that he will be travelling to Munich? Well, that's not an issue that need concern you. You leave Cleverley to us. Absolutely. I know, Oscar. Both men fell silent, watching him. Leggett had a peculiar sense of, what was it, he wondered afterwards, not of déjà vu exactly, but of inevitability, that he'd always known Munich was not done with him, that however far he might travel from that place and time, he was forever caught in its gravitational pull, and would be dragged back towards it eventually. Of course, he said. Of course I'll do it. By the time he got back to number 10, Sears had gone for the night. Cleverley was still working. He could see the light under his door and could hear his voice talking on the telephone. He crept past, anxious to avoid the possibility of an encounter, collected his overnight case from the corner of his office, and set off to walk home. Images he had consciously suppressed for half a decade stalked him at every step. Memories not so much of Germany, but of Oxford. As he walked past the Abbey, he sensed again the impossibly tall figure loping at his side through a damp evening along the Turl. Night is the best time for friendship, my dear Hugh. His profile in the lamplight as he stopped to light a cigarette. Beautiful, fanatical, almost cruel. And that astonishing smile after he had exhaled, the swirling skirts of his full coat brushing the cobbles. The curious combination of his manliness — he had seemed so much older and more experienced than the rest of them in the boy world of Oxford — and yet a self-dramatising defeatism, my passionate melancholy, that was entirely adolescent, indeed verging on the comic. He had once clambered up onto Magdalen Bridge and threatened to throw himself into the river in despair at what he said was their mad generation, until Leggett had pointed out that he would only succeed in getting himself wet and possibly catching a chill. He used to complain that he lacked the one great characteristic of the English, and that is distance, not only from one another, but from all experience. I believe it is the secret of the English art of living, he said. Leggett could remember every word. He reached the end of North Street, found his key, and let himself into the house. Now that the immediate crisis seemed to be over, he'd half expected to find Pamela at home with the children. But when he turned on the light, he saw that the place was empty, exactly as he'd left it. He set down his suitcase at the bottom of the stairs. Still wearing his coat, he went into the drawing-room, picked up the telephone, and dialed the operator. It was after 10, an unsociable hour for a call, especially in the English shires, but he thought the circumstances justified it. His father-in-law answered, pedantically reciting his number. Pamela always said he'd done something unspeakably boring in the city before retiring at 50, and Leggett could believe it, although he'd been very careful never to inquire precisely what it was. He avoided speaking to his in-laws as much as possible. Somehow the conversation always turned to money and his lack of it. "Hello, sir. It's Hugh. Sorry to ring so late." "Hugh!" For once the old boy actually sounded glad to hear him. "I must say we've been thinking about you rather a lot today. What a business it's been! Were you very much involved?" "Oh, only on the margins, you know." "Well, having been all the way through the last show, I can't tell you the relief at avoiding another." He put his hand over the receiver, and Leggett heard him call out, "Darling, it's Hugh." He came back on the line immediately. "You must tell me all about it. Were you in the house when the Prime Minister received the news?" Leggett sat in an armchair and patiently described the events of the day for a couple of minutes, until he felt he'd done all that filial politeness required of him. "Anyway, sir, I can give you a full blow-by-blow the next time I see you. I just wanted a quick word with Pamela, if I might." "Pamela?" The voice on the other end sounded suddenly confused. "Isn't she with you? She left the children with us and drove back to London about 4 hours ago." "Oh, actually, sir, don't worry. I think I can hear her at the door now." After he had hung up, he sat and stared at the telephone for a long while. Occasionally his eyes flickered to the diary that lay beside it. A Smithson featherweight diary, bound in red morocco, gilt-edged, of the sort he bought her every Christmas. Why did she leave it lying around, except for him to pick up, to leaf through with his usual clumsy, nervous fingers, to find the date, to read the number, and for once, just this once, the only time he had ever done so, to call it? It rang a long time before it was answered. A man's voice, vaguely familiar, came on the line, confident, relaxed. "Yep, hello?" Leggett pressed the receiver very hard against his ear and listened intently. He heard the sound of the sea. "Hello? Who is this?" And then, in the background, distinctly enough that he suspected she might have intended it to be overheard, the voice of his wife. "Whoever it is, tell them to go away." Day 3. Chapter 1. The Führer's special train was unusually heavy, entirely made of welded steel. It steamed steadily southwards through the night at an average speed of 55 kilometres per hour. It did not stop. It did not even slow down. It passed through big cities such as Leipzig and smaller country towns and villages, and between them it traversed great stretches of nothingness, broken only by the occasional light of an isolated farmhouse. Sleepless, Hartmann lay in his underclothes on the top bunk, his fingers parting the blinds so that he could stare into the darkness. He had the sensation of voyaging in a liner across an ocean of unmeasurable extent. This immensity was what he had never been able to convey to his Oxford friends, whose concept of their own nationality was so nicely bounded by a coast. This hard, wide, vast landscape, fertile in its genius, limitless in its possibilities, which demanded a constant effort of will and imagination to order into a modern state. It was hard to talk about such feelings without sounding mystical. Even Hugh had not understood. To his English ear one invariably came across as a German nationalist. Although what was wrong with that? A corruption of honest patriotism was one of the many things for which Hartmann would never forgive the Austrian corporal. The sound of Sauer's rhythmic, heavy breathing rose through the thin mattress. Before they'd even left Berlin's city limits, the Sturmbannführer had pulled his rank to insist on having the bottom bunk. Not that Hartmann had objected. It meant he was able to put his belongings into the luggage rack immediately above his head. The wide string mesh bulged under the weight of his suitcase. He had not let it out of his sight. Soon after 5 a.m. he noticed the sky at its edges beginning to turn an oyster grey. Gradually the dark crests of the wooded pine hills emerged, serrated like saw's teeth against the spreading light, while in the valleys the white mist seemed as solid as a glacier. For the next half-hour he watched as the countryside took on colour. Green and yellow meadows, red-roofed villages, white-painted wooden church spires, a turreted castle with blue shutters beside a wide, slow river he assumed must be the Danube. When he was sure that sunrise could only be a few minutes away, he sat up and cautiously took down his suitcase. He muffled the noise of the catches one at a time with his hand and opened the lid. He extracted the document and stuffed it under his vest. Then he put on a clean white shirt and buttoned it. He took the gun from his jacket and folded his trousers around it. Holding that in one hand and with his shaving kit tucked under the other arm, he carefully descended the ladder. As Hartmann's bare feet touched the floor of the compartment, Sauer muttered and turned over. His uniform was on a hanger at the end of his bed. He'd spent a long time before he went to sleep brushing it and straightening the creases. His boots were perfectly aligned beneath it. Hartmann waited until his breathing had resumed its regular pattern, then slowly lifted the catch and slid open the door. The corridor was empty. He swayed along it towards the toilet at the back of the carriage. Once inside, he drew the bolt and turned on the light. Like the sleeper compartment, it was lined in polished, light-coloured wood with modernist fittings made of stainless steel. There were tiny little swastikas on the taps. There was no escaping the Führer's aesthetic, thought Hartmann, not even when one took a shit. He inspected his face in the mirror above the tiny wash-basin. Disgusting. He removed his shirt and lathered his chin. He had to shave with his feet braced wide apart to steady himself against the movement of the train. When he had finished, he dried his face, then crouched on his haunches and inspected the wooden panel beneath the sink. He ran his fingers around the back until he found a gap. He pulled, and it came away easily, exposing the plumbing. He unwrapped the gun from his trousers, wedged it behind the waste pipe, and pushed the panel back into place. 5 minutes later he was making his way along the corridor. Beyond the windows an empty autobahn ran beside the railway track, gleaming in the early morning sunshine. He slid open the door of his compartment to discover Sauer in his underwear bent over the lower bunk. He tipped out Hartmann's suitcase and was rummaging around the contents. Hartmann's jacket lay next to it. It looked as though he'd checked that already. He didn't even bother to turn round. "I'm sorry, Hartmann, it's nothing personal. I'm sure you're a decent fellow, but when a man is this close to the Führer, I'm not prepared to take any chances." He stood and gestured to the mess on the mattress. "There you are. You can put it all back now." "Don't you want to give me a full body search while you're at it?" Hartmann raised his hands. "It won't be necessary." "Come on, man, don't be so offended. I've apologized. You know as well as I do the Foreign Ministry is rotten with reaction. What is it that Goering says about you diplomats? That you sharpen your pencils all morning and make tea all afternoon." Hartmann pretended to be offended, then nodded curtly. "You're right. I admire your vigilance." "Excellent. Wait for me while I shave, and then we will go to breakfast." He picked up his uniform and boots and went out into the corridor. After he had gone, Hartmann tugged the document out from under his vest. His hands were shaking. He placed it in the suitcase. Surely Sauer wouldn't search it again? Or perhaps he would. He imagined him at that very moment on his knees inspecting behind the wash-basin. Hartmann folded his clothes back into the case, closed the catches, and heaved it up into the luggage rack. By the time he'd finished dressing and had regained his composure, there was a clump of boots in the corridor. The door opened and Sauer was back, once more clad in his SS uniform, looking as if he had just stepped off the parade ground. He threw his sponge bag on the bed. "Let's go." They had to pass through another sleeper carriage to reach the dining car. The train was all awake by now. Half-dressed men, or still in underpants, were squeezing past each other in the narrow corridor and queuing outside the toilets. There was a smell of sweat and cigarettes, a changing-room atmosphere. Laughter as the train jolted and they were thrown together. Sauer exchanged hiles with a couple of SS comrades. He opened the connecting door and Hartmann followed, stepping over the metal platform that made a junction into a restaurant car. Here it was all much quieter. White linen tablecloths, the smell of coffee, the chink of cutlery on china. A waiter wheeling a trolley laden with food. At the far end of the carriage, an army general in a field grey uniform with red collar tabs was talking to a trio of officers. Sauer noticed Hartmann staring at him. "That's General Keitel, Chief of the Wehrmacht Supreme Command. He's breakfasting with the Führer's military adjutants. What's a general doing at a peace conference? Perhaps it may not turn out to be a peace conference." Sauer winked. They took a nearby table for two. Hartmann sat with his back to the engine. The carriage darkened as they passed beneath a station canopy. On the platform a line of waiting passengers waved. He guessed an announcement must have been made over the loudspeaker that the through train was Hitler's. Enthusiastic faces whirled past the window in a mist of steam. "If nothing else," continued Sauer, unfolding his napkin, The presence of General Keitel will remind those elderly gentlemen from London and Paris that a single word from a Führer is all it will require for the army to cross the Czech frontier. I thought Mussolini had put a stop to mobilization. The Duce will be joining the train for the final part of the journey to Munich. Who knows what will happen when the leaders of fascism confer? Perhaps the Führer will persuade him to change his mind. He beckoned to the waiter to bring him coffee. When he turned back to the table, his eyes were shining. Admit it, Hartmann. Whatever happens, isn't there something immensely satisfying, after all those years of national humiliation, in finally making the British and the French dance to our tune? It certainly is an amazing achievement. The man was intoxicated, thought Hartmann, drunk on a little man's dreams of revenge. The waiter arrived with a tray of food, and they both filled their plates. He took a bread roll and broke it in half. He found he had no appetite, even though he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten. "May I ask, sir, what you did before you joined the Foreign Minister's staff?" He really didn't care. He was making conversation. "I worked in the office of the Reichsführer's SS. And before that?" "Before the party came to power, you mean?" "I sold automobiles in Essen." He was eating a hard-boiled egg. A piece of yolk was stuck to his chin. Suddenly his face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, I can see what you're thinking, Hartmann. What a vulgar fellow, a car salesman, and now he fancies himself as a second Bismarck. But we have done something your kind never managed. We have made Germany great again." "Actually, I was thinking you have egg on your chin." Sauer put down his knife and fork and wiped his mouth with a napkin. His face had turned red. It was a mistake to have teased him, thought Hartmann. Sauer would never forgive him. And at some point in the future, maybe later that day or next month or next year, revenge would be exacted. The meal resumed in silence. "Herr von Hartmann?" Hartmann looked round. A large man, portly in a double-breasted suit, was looming over him. His domed head was bald, his thin dark hair combed back and plastered into place behind his ears with oil. He was sweating. "Dr. Schmidt." Hartmann put down his napkin and stood. "Forgive me for disturbing your meal, Sturmbannführer." The Foreign Ministry's chief interpreter bowed towards Sauer. "We have received the overnight English-language press summary, and I wondered if I could trouble you, Hartmann." "Of course. Excuse me, Sauer." Hartmann followed Schmidt the length of the dining car, past General Keitel's table and the next carriage. Along the left side were desks, typewriters, filing cabinets, and on the right the windows were blacked out. Wehrmacht signal officers wearing headphones faced one another across tables stacked with short-wave radio equipment. It wasn't so much a train as a mobile command post. It struck Hartmann that the original plan must have been for Hitler to travel in it to the Czech frontier. "The Führer expects to see a press summary as soon as he gets up. 2 pages will be sufficient. Concentrate on the headlines and the editorial view. Get one of the men to type it for you." He deposited a sheaf of handwritten English transcripts on a desk and hurried away. Hartmann sat. It was a relief to have something to do. He shuffled through dozens of quotations, pulling out the most interesting and sorting them according to the influence of the publication. He found a pencil and began to write. The London Times praises Chamberlain for his indomitable resolution. The New York Times, the sense of relief felt around the world. The Manchester Guardian, for the first time in weeks we seem to turn towards the light. The tone was the same, regardless of the political line of the paper. All described the dramatic scene in the House of Commons as Chamberlain read out the Führer's message. Within minutes and even seconds the message of hope was being hailed by millions whose lives a moment before seemed to hang upon the pull of a trigger. The British Prime Minister was the hero of the world. When he had finished his translations, he was directed by the unit commander to an army corporal. Hartmann lit a cigarette and stood behind the corporal's shoulder and dictated. The machine was a special typewriter, reserved for documents that went direct to a Führer, its typeface almost a centimetre high. His digest came out at exactly 2 pages. As the corporal wound it out of the typewriter, an SS adjutant appeared at the far end of the carriage. He looked harassed. "Where's the foreign press summary?" "I have it here." Hartmann waved the pages. "Thank God! Follow me!" As the adjutant opened the door, he pointed to Hartmann's cigarette. "No smoking beyond this point." They entered a vestibule. An SS sentry saluted. The adjutant opened the door to a panelled conference room with a long, polished table and seats for 20. He indicated that Hartmann should go ahead of him. "Is this your first time?" "Yes." Salute, look him in the eye, but do not speak unless he speaks to you. They had reached the end of a carriage and passed through into the vestibule of the next. Another sentry. The adjutant patted Hartmann on the back. "You'll be fine." He knocked lightly on the door and opened it. "The foreign press summary, my Führer." Hartmann walked into the room and raised his arm. "Heil Hitler!" He was leaning over a table, his hands bunched into fists, looking down at a set of technical drawings. He turned to glance at Hartmann. He was wearing a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles. He took them off and looked past Hartmann to the adjutant. "Tell Keitel to set up the maps in here." Familiar metallic voice. It was strange to hear it at a conversational level and not ranting over a loudspeaker. "Yes, my Führer." He held out his hand for the press summary. "And you are?" "Hartmann, my Führer." He took the 2 sheets and started reading, rocking gently up and down on the balls of his feet. Hartmann had an impression of great energy, barely suppressed. After a while he said contemptuously, "Chamberlain this, Chamberlain that, Chamberlain." When he reached the bottom of the first page, he stopped and flexed his head as if he had a crick in his neck, then read aloud in a tone of intense sarcasm. "Mr. Chamberlain's description of his last meeting with Herr Hitler is agreeable proof that his strong candour was awarded with liking and respect. Who wrote this shit?" "It was an editorial in the Times of London, my Führer." He raised his eyebrows as if he expected nothing else, and flicked over to the second page. Hartmann looked briefly round the carriage. A saloon car, armchairs, a sofa, watercolours of pastoral scenes hanging on the light-coloured wood panels. It occurred to him that the 2 of them had been entirely alone for more than a minute. He inspected the fragile head, bent oblivious reading. If he had known, he would have brought his gun. He imagined feeling for it in his inside pocket, quickly withdrawing it, pointing the barrel, a moment of eye contact perhaps before he squeezed the trigger, a final look, and then the explosion of blood and tissue. He would have been reviled until the end of time, and he realized he could never have done it. The insight into his own weakness appalled him. "So you speak English?" "Yes, my Führer." "You have spent time in England?" "I was at Oxford for 2 years. He looked up, stared out of a window. His expression became dreamy. "Oxford is the second oldest university in Europe, founded in the 12th century. I've often wondered what it would be like to see it. Heidelberg was founded a century later. Of course, Bologna is the oldest of them all." The door opened and the adjutant appeared. "General Keitel, my Führer." Keitel marched in and saluted. Behind him an army officer carried rolled-up charts. "You wish to have the maps in here, my Führer?" "Yes. Good morning. Set them on the table. I want to show them to the Duke." He threw the press summary on the desk and watched as the maps were unrolled. One was of Czechoslovakia, the other of Germany. On both the positions of military units were drawn in red. He folded his arms and stared down at them. 40 divisions to destroy the Czechs. We would have done it in a week. 10 divisions to hold the conquered territory, the remaining 30 transferred to the west to hold the frontier. He rocked up and down again on the balls of his feet. It would have worked. It could still work. Liking and respect. That old asshole! This train is heading in the wrong direction, Keitel. Yes, my Führer. The adjutant touched Hartmann on the arm and gestured to the door. As he left the compartment, he looked back for a moment, but all attention was now focused on the maps, and he saw that his existence had already been forgotten. Chapter 2. Leggett had spent the night at his club. He had arrived to discover a backgammon evening in progress. Much strong drink had been taken. Until long after midnight the muffled noises of heavy male conversation and stupid laughter permeated the floorboards of his room. Even so, he preferred it to the silence of North Street, where he would only have lain awake listening to the sound for Pamela's key in the latch, assuming, that is, she bothered to come home at all. On previous form, it was just as likely she'd slink back a day or two later, offering some alibi which they both knew would never endure the humiliation of checking. As the hours passed, he stared at the pattern of the street lights on the ceiling and thought about Oxford and Munich and his marriage, trying to disentangle the three. But however much he tried, the images remained entwined, and his methodical mind became disordered with fatigue. By morning the skin beneath his eyes was puffy like black crepe, and in his tiredness he'd shaved too closely, so that his cheeks and chin were raw, pricked with tiny pinpoints of blood. It was too early for breakfast. The tables were still being laid. Outside the muggy weather had broken and it was drizzling. The air was a moist, cool gauze on his face. The traffic just beginning to build from St. James's Street. Wearing his Homburg and his Crombie, his suitcase in his hand, he trudged the shiny wet pavements down the slope towards Downing Street. Against the battleship grey sky, the barrage balloons were barely visible, like tiny silvery fish. There was a small bedraggled crowd in Downing Street. The workmen had finished the wall of sandbags around the Foreign Office entrance. 6 black cars were drawn up by number 10, all the way back beyond number 11, pointing towards Whitehall, ready to take the Prime Minister's party to the Heston Aerodrome. The policeman saluted. Inside the lobby, 3 senior Foreign Office officials stood with their suitcases at their feet, like guests waiting to check out of a hotel. He took them in at a glance. William Strang, the tall, dehydrated, broomstick-like figure who'd taken over from Wigram as head of the Central Department, and had already been twice with the Prime Minister to visit Hitler. Sir William Malkin, the Foreign Secretary's senior legal adviser, who had also met Hitler and looked like a reassuring family solicitor. The bulky, slope-shouldered Frank Ashton Watkin, head of economic relations, who'd spent much of the summer in Czechoslovakia listening to the grievances of the Sudeten Germans, and who was known behind his back, on account of his drooping moustache and lugubrious manner, as the Walrus. Leggett thought it a curious trio to send into battle against the Nazis. What must they make of us, he thought. Strang said, "I didn't know you were coming to Munich, Leggett." "Neither did I, sir, until last night." He heard the deference in his tone and felt a flicker of self-contempt. The youthful third secretary, the promising high-flyer, always careful never to seem too full of himself. "Well, I hope you've taken something for travel sickness. In my experience, and I am beginning to acquire a lot of it, flying can be as rough as a channel crossing." "Oh dear, I'm afraid I haven't. Will you excuse me for a moment?" He walked quickly towards the back of the building and found Sears in his office reading the Times. His suitcase was by his desk. He said in a dull voice, "I really am most awfully sorry, Cecil. I didn't ask to go. I'd honestly prefer to stay behind in London." Sears made an effort to look unconcerned. "My dear fellow, don't give it a second thought. I always said it ought to be you, not me, and Yvonne will be relieved." "That's very decent of you. When did you hear?" "Cleverly told me 10 minutes ago." "What did he say?" "He simply said he'd changed his mind." "Is there anything more to it than that?" "Not that I'm aware of." The lie came easily. "Well," Sears took a step closer and peered at him with concern, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but you are all right. You look a little rough." "I didn't sleep much last night." "Nervous about flying?" "Not really." "Ever been up in a plane before?" "No." "Well, if it's any consolation, as I said to Yvonne this morning, being on the same flight as the Prime Minister must be about as safe as one can get." "That's what I keep telling myself." From the corridor came the sound of voices. Leggett smiled and shook hands with Sears. "I'll see you when I get back." The Prime Minister had descended from his flat and was walking towards the entrance hall with Mrs. Chamberlain, Horace Wilson, Lord Dunglass and Oscar Cleverley. A pair of detectives followed, carrying the PM's luggage, including the red dispatch boxes containing his official papers. Behind them trailed 2 garden-room secretaries, one a middle-aged woman Leggett didn't recognise, the other Joan. Cleverley noticed him and waited for him to catch up. They walked together. His mouth was clenched, his voice low and angry. "I've no idea what's going on, but I have acceded, with considerable reservations, I might add, to Colonel Mingus's request to allow you to accompany the PM. You'll be in charge of his boxes, as well as dealing with anything else that comes up." He gave him the keys to the dispatch cases. "Make contact with the office as soon as you reach Munich." "Yes, sir." "I trust I don't need to emphasize the absolute necessity that you do nothing whatsoever that might imperil the success of this conference." "Of course not, sir." "And when this is all over, you and I will need to have a talk about the future." "I understand." They'd reached the lobby. The Prime Minister was embracing his wife. The Downing Street staff gave him a discreet round of applause. He broke away, smiled shyly, and raised his hat to them. His complexion was ruddy, his eye bright. There was no hint of tiredness. He looked as if he'd just come back from the river for breakfast after landing a good salmon. The porter opened the door, and he strode out into the rain. He paused to allow his photograph to be taken, and then stepped across the pavement and into the first car, where Horace Wilson was already waiting. His entourage filed out after him. Unconsciously they'd arranged themselves in order of seniority. Leggett was the last to leave, carrying the 2 red boxes and his own suitcase. He gave them to the driver and climbed into the 4th car, next to Alec Dunglass. The doors slammed and the convoy pulled away, out of Downing Street, into Whitehall, around Parliament Square and south along the river. It was not at all clear to anyone, including Leggett, why Dunglass had been included in the party, except that he was a friendly face with a country house in Scotland, extensive fishing rights on the Tweed, and therefore good for the Prime Minister's morale. Miss Watson insisted that beneath his diffident manner lurked one of the cleverest politicians she'd ever encountered. "You'll be Prime Minister one day, Mr. Leggett, mark my words, and you'll remember that I was the first to say it." But as Dunglass would in due course inherit his father's title and become the 14th Earl of Hume, and as it was inconceivable that in the modern age a Premier should sit in the House of Lords, her prediction was dismissed in the private office as a folie d'amour. He had a very thin, straight smile and a curious, tight-lipped way of speaking, as if he were practising to be a ventriloquist. After a few desultory exchanges about the rain and what the weather might be like in Munich, they lapsed into silence. Then, as they were passing through Hammersmith, he said abruptly, "Did you hear about Winston's remark to the PM at the end of his speech yesterday?" "No, what was that?" "He came up to him at the dispatch box while everyone was still cheering, and said, 'I congratulate you on your good fortune. You were very lucky.'" Dunglass shook his head. "I mean, really, one can level many charges against Neville. One can argue his policy is entirely wrong. But one can hardly maintain this conference in Munich is a matter of luck. He has worked himself half to death to achieve it." He gave Leggett a sidelong look. "I noticed you were joining in the applause yourself." "I shouldn't have done that. I'm supposed to be neutral, but one rather got carried away by the mood. I should think 9/10 of the country were relieved." "Yes, even the Socialists are on their feet. It seems we're all appeasers now." We'd left central London and were motoring into the suburbs. The dual carriageway was wide and modern, lined by pebble-dashed semis with small front gardens and privet hedges, interspersed with light industrial factories. Household names gleamed with grim cheerfulness through the pouring rain. Gillette, Beecham's Powders, Firestone Tire and Rubber. Chamberlain must have been responsible for a lot of his development, thought Leggett, when he was Minister of Housing and then Chancellor of the Exchequer. The country had come through the Depression and was prosperous again. As they drove through Osterley, he noticed that people were starting to wave as they passed. A few, at first, mostly mothers taking their children to school, but gradually they became more numerous, until, when the convoy slowed to turn off right towards Heston, he saw that drivers had pulled over to both sides of the Great West Road and were standing beside their cars. "Neville's people," murmured Dunglass without moving his lips. At the entrance to the aerodrome they came to a halt. Spectators blocked the road. Beyond the chain-link fence and white buildings, Leggett could see a pair of large planes drawn up on the grass at the edge of a concrete apron, lit by the lights of the newsreel crews, surrounded by a tightly packed crowd of several hundred. Their umbrellas were up. From a distance they looked like a bulbous black fungus. The car moved forwards again, past saluting policemen, through the gate, and then in a wide sweep around the back of the terminal and hangar, and on to the airfield where the convoy halted. A policeman opened the rear passenger door of the lead car, and the Prime Minister emerged to cheers. Dunglass sighed. "Well, I suppose this is it." He and Leggett climbed out. They collected their suitcases and the red boxes. Leggett carried one, Dunglass insisted on taking the other, and they set off towards the plains. The rain had stopped. The umbrellas were being furled. As they came closer, Leggett recognised the tall figure of Lord Halifax in his bowler hat, and then, to his amazement, Sir John Simon, Sam Hoare, and the rest of the Cabinet. He said to Dunglass, "Was this in the schedule?" "No, it's a surprise. It was the Chancellor's idea. I was sworn to secrecy. It seems that suddenly they all want to share his limelight. Even Duff." The crowd jostled forwards, pressing against the line of policemen for a better view. Reporters, airport workers in blue and brown overalls, local people, schoolboys, a mother with a baby in her arms. The newsreel cameras swung to follow Chamberlain's progress. He was grinning broadly, waving his hat, childish in his delight. Finally he stood in front of a cluster of microphones. "When I was a little boy," he began, and paused as those who were still talking were shushed into silence. "I used to repeat, if at first you don't succeed, try again. That's what I am doing." He had a small piece of paper in his hand, and glanced down at it briefly, reminding himself of a line he had prepared. Then looked up again. "When I come back, I hope I may be able to say, as Hotspur says in Henry IV, 'Out of this nettle, danger, we pluck this flower, safety.'" He nodded emphatically. The crowd cheered. He smiled and waved his hat again, milking every last drop of acclaim, then turned towards his plane. Leggett moved forward with Dunglass. They gave their suitcases to the aircrew, who were loading the luggage into the belly of the aircraft. Leggett kept possession of the red boxes. The Prime Minister shook hands with Halifax and mounted the 3 metal steps into the back of the plane. He ducked out of sight, then re-emerged for one last round of cheering before vanishing for good. Wilson scuttled up next, followed by Strang, Malkin, and Ashton-Watkin. Leggett stood aside to let Dunglass go ahead of him. Close up, the plane seemed smaller and more fragile than it had at a distance. It was only about 40 feet long. He thought one had to admire the Prime Minister's nerve. When he'd first flown to see Hitler, he hadn't even wanted to tell him he was coming until he was in the air, so that the dictator couldn't refuse to meet him. Standing on the bottom step, looking out at the enthusiastic faces, he felt suddenly intrepid himself. A pioneer. He stooped to pass through the low door. Inside the cabin were 14 seats, 7 on either side, with an aisle between them and a door at the far end of the cockpit. The nose of the plane was tilted 5 or 6 feet higher than the tail. There was a noticeable slope. It felt small and oddly intimate. The Prime Minister was already in his place at the front, on the left, with Wilson to his right. Leggett hoisted the red boxes into the wire luggage rack, removed his coat and hat, and stowed them alongside. He took the right-hand seat at the back so that he could see the Prime Minister in case he was needed. A man in a pilot's uniform was the last to board. He locked the door after him and walked to the front of the plane. "Prime Minister, gentlemen, welcome. My name is Commander Robinson. I am your pilot. This is a Lockheed Electra operated by British Airways. We shall be flying at an altitude of 7,000 feet at a maximum speed of 250 miles an hour. Our flying time to Munich is approximately 3 hours. Would you please fasten your safety belts? It may get a little bumpy, so I suggest you keep them fastened unless you need to move around the cabin." He went into the cockpit and took the seat next to the co-pilot. Through the open door, Leggett could see his hand reaching across the instrument panel, flicking switches. One of the engines stuttered into life, then the other. The noise increased. The cabin began to shake. The note seemed to climb a musical scale from bass to treble until it was subsumed into a single deafening sawing noise, and the plane lurched forward onto the grass airfield. They bumped their way over the rough ground for a minute or two, raindrops scudding across the windows, then turned and stopped. Leggett fastened his seatbelt. He looked around at the terminal building. Beyond it were white factory chimneys. Columns of smoke rose almost vertically. There was not much wind. Well, that must be good. He felt quite calm. "I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above." Perhaps Yeats would have been a more appropriate poet for the Prime Minister to quote than Shakespeare. The engines became louder, and suddenly the Lockheed began to accelerate across the grass. Leggett gripped the armrests as the plane raced past the terminal. Yet still they remained firmly earthbound. Then, just as he thought they were about to crash into the fence at the edge of the airfield, the bottom of his stomach seemed to fall away, and the cabin tilted upwards even more sharply, pressing him back into his seat. The propellers clawed at the air, hauling them into the sky. Slowly they banked, and the landscape slid past the window. Green fields, red roof, slick grey streets. He looked down at the Great West Road a couple of 100 feet below, at the semi-detached houses and the cars still drawn up with their drivers beside them, and saw that in almost every garden people had come out and were craning their heads to the sky and waving, hundreds of them, waving with both arms crossed above their heads in frantic farewell. And then they judded up into the base of the low cloud, and the scene flickered out of sight. After a few minutes of climbing steeply through thick grey mist, they broke free into a burst of sunshine and blueness, more beautiful than anything Leggett had imagined. A crystal-white vista of peaks and ravines and waterfalls carved out of cloud stretched into the distance. It reminded him of the Bavarian Alps, but purer and unsullied by humanity. The plane levelled off. He unfastened his seatbelt and made his way unsteadily towards the front. "Excuse me, Prime Minister, I just wanted to let you know that I have your boxes whenever you need them." Chamberlain was staring out of the window. He looked at Leggett. His earlier good spirits seemed to have left him. Or perhaps, thought Leggett, they'd only ever been a show for the crowds and the cameras. "Thank you. I suppose we had better make a start." "Why don't you have some breakfast first, PM? Hugh, would you mind asking the pilot?" Leggett put his head into the cockpit. "Sorry to bother you, but where may I find some food?" "There's a locker at the back, sir." Leggett lingered for a moment, briefly mesmerised once more by the sight of the clouds through the windscreen, then turned back to the cabin. Strang, Malkin, Ashton, Watkin, even Dunglass, now they all looked pensive. In the rear of the plane he found a locker, 2 wicker hampers stencilled with the name of the Savoy Hotel, crammed full of neatly wrapped and labelled packages, grouse and smoked salmon sandwiches, pâté and caviar, bottles of claret and beer and cider, flasks of tea and coffee. It seemed an inappropriate feast, a picnic for a day at the races. He carried the hampers to the empty seats in the middle of the plane. Dunglass got up to help him distribute it all. The Prime Minister took a cup of tea and refused everything else. He sat very upright, holding his saucer in his left hand, his little finger crooked primly as he sipped. Leggett retreated to his seat with coffee and a smoked salmon sandwich. After a while, Strang went past him to the toilet cubicle. He stopped on his way back, buttoning his flies. "Everything all right?" The head of the Central Department was another official who had gone through the war and retained the habit of talking to his subordinates as if he were inspecting their trench. "Yes, thank you, sir." "The condemned men ate a hearty breakfast." He folded his tall frame into the seat beside Leggett. He was in his mid-40s, but looked 60. His suit exuded a faint aroma of pipe tobacco. "Do you realise you're the only man on the plane who speaks German?" "I hadn't thought of that, sir." Strang gazed out of the window. "Let's hope this landing's better than the last one. There was a rainstorm over Munich. The pilot couldn't see a thing. We ended up being thrown around all over the place. The only person who didn't seem to mind was the PM. He's quite a cool customer, isn't he? One never really knows what's going on in his mind." He leaned across the aisle and spoke more quietly. "I just wanted to give you a gentle warning, Hugh. You haven't been through this before. Now there's a chance this whole thing might turn into a fiasco. We've no agreed agenda. No parliamentary work has been done. There's no official papers. If it breaks down and Hitler grabs the chance to invade Czechoslovakia after all, we could be in the ludicrous position of having the leaders of Berlin and France both stranded in Germany on the outbreak of war. Surely that's not likely. I was with the PM in Bad Godesberg. We thought we had an agreement then, until Hitler suddenly came up with a new set of demands. It's not like dealing with a normal head of government. He's more like some barbarian chieftain out of a Germanic legend. Ermanaric, Theodoric, with his house-carls gathered round him. They leap up when he comes in, and he freezes them with a look, asserts his authority, and then he settles down at a long table to feast with them, and to laugh and boast. Who'd want to be in the PM's shoes, trying to negotiate with such a creature? A pilot appeared in the doorway of the cockpit. "Gentlemen, just to let you know, we've crossed the English Channel." Prime Minister glanced down the plane and gestured to Leggett. "I think we'd better start work on those boxes now." The Führer's train was slowing. After more than 12 hours of relentless forward motion, Hartmann could detect a slight but definite swaying back and forth as the driver gently applied the brakes. They were in the hilly country an hour south of Munich, not far from where he had gone walking with Hugh and Lena in the summer of '32. Beyond the windows the woodland had begun to thin. A river glinted silver through the trees, and then an ancient town curved into view on the opposite bank. Gaily painted houses, pale blue, lime green, canary yellow, fronted onto the water. Behind them a grey stone medieval castle sprawled across a wooded hill. In the distance rose the Alps. Framed by the window, it looked exactly like a Reichsbahn poster for a Tyrolean holiday that had lured them south 6 years ago. Even the half-timbered station they were pulling into was picturesque. The train slowed to a walking pace, and then, with a slight jolt and a squeak of metal, stopped. It let out an exhausted exhalation of steam. A sign beside the waiting room announced Kufstein. Austria, then, thought Hartmann, or rather what had been Austria until the Führer got to work on the map. The platform was deserted. He checked his watch. It was a good watch, a Rolex, given to him by his mother on his 21st birthday. With beautiful efficiency, they had arrived by 9:30 a.m. precisely. He wondered if the British delegation had taken off yet. He rose from the table in the communications wagon, walked to the door, and lowered the window. All along the length of the train, men were disembarking to stretch their legs. The station itself appeared ghostly in its emptiness. Hartmann guessed it must have been sealed off by the security services. But then something caught his eye. A man's white face staring through a grimy window. He was wearing a Reichsbahn cap. When he realized he'd been spotted, he ducked out of sight. Hartmann jumped down onto the platform and headed straight towards him. He pushed open the door and entered what looked to be the station-master's office, stuffy with the burned-out reek of coal and cigarettes. The official was at his desk, lank-haired, 40s, pretending to read some papers. As Hartmann approached, he scrambled to his feet. Hartmann said, "Heil Hitler." The man saluted. "Heil Hitler. I'm travelling with the Führer. I need to use your telephone." "Of course, sir. An honour." He pushed it towards Hartmann, who waved his hand imperiously. "Get me an operator." "Oh, yes, sir." When the man gave him a phone, Hartmann said to the operator, "I need to place a call to Berlin. I am with the Führer. It is a matter of the utmost urgency." "What number in Berlin, sir?" He gave Kurt's direct line. She repeated it back to him. "Shall I call you when I have a connection?" "As soon as possible." He hung up and lit a cigarette. Through the window he could see activity further up the platform. The locomotive was being uncoupled and was getting up steam again. A group of SS men had gathered around the door of one of the carriages, facing away from the train, with their machine guns clasped across their chests. An adjutant opened the door and Hitler appeared. The railway official standing beside Hartmann gasped. The Führer stepped down onto the platform. He was wearing his peaked cap, his belted brown uniform, highly polished jackboots. Behind him was a Reichenführer SS Heinrich Himmler. He stood for a moment, flexing his shoulders, staring at the Kufstein castle, then set off down the platform in Hartmann's direction, accompanied by Himmler and his SS bodyguard. As he walked, he swung his arms back and forth in unison, presumably to stimulate his circulation. There was something about the motion that was disturbing. Simeon. The telephone rang. Hartmann picked it up. "I have your connection, sir." He heard the number ringing. "Court's office?" He turned away from the window. The line was poor. It was hard to hear. He had to put a finger in one ear and shout over the noise of a locomotive. "It's Hartmann. Is Dr. Court there?" "No, Herr Hartmann. Can I help you?" "Possibly. Do you know if we've received notification from London of who will be in Prime Minister Chamberlain's delegation?" "Wait, please. I'll check." The Führer had turned around and was strolling back in the direction he'd come. He was talking to Himmler. In the distance, Hartmann could hear the whistle of another train approaching from the south. "Herr Hartmann, I have the list from London." "Wait." Hartmann clicked his fingers impatiently at the railway official and mimed writing. The man tore his gaze from a window, took a stubby pencil from behind his ear and handed it over. Hartmann sat at the desk and found a scrap of paper. As he wrote each name, he recited it back to her, to be sure it was correct. "Wilson, Strang, Malkin, Ashton-Watkin, Dunglass, Leggett." He grinned. "Excellent, thank you, goodbye." He hung up and cheerfully threw the pencil back at the railway man, who fumbled and just managed to catch it. "The office of the Führer thanks you for your help." He slipped the list of names into his pocket and went outside into the fresh mountain air. The second train was crawling into the station. A large welcoming party had gathered, with Hitler at its centre. The cab of the oncoming locomotive was decorated with the green, white and red tricolour of Italy. It came to a halt just short of the Führer's train. An SS guard stepped forward smartly and opened a door. Half a minute later, in a pale grey uniform and peaked cap, Mussolini appeared on the top step. His arms shot out in salute. Hitler did the same. The Duce descended to the platform. The dictators shook hands. Not at all the usual diplomatic formality, but a warm and mutual double clasp. They might almost have been two old lovers, thought Hartmann, the way they were grinning and gazing into each other's eyes. The flashes of the photographers lit up the reunion, and suddenly everyone was beaming. Hitler, Mussolini, Himmler, Keitel, and Ciano, the Italian foreign minister and Mussolini's son-in-law, who had emerged from the train with the rest of the delegation. All were in uniform. Hitler gestured for the Italians to accompany him. Hartmann realised he'd better get out of the way. He half-turned just in time to see Strubenführer Sauer disappear into the railwayman's office. Immediately he swivelled back to his original position and stood frozen, unsure of what to do. It could hardly be a coincidence, which meant that Sauer must have been watching him all along. Now presumably he was going to question the railway official. Hartmann tried to remember what he had said. Was there anything incriminating? Thank God Court hadn't been in his office, otherwise he might have been indiscreet. Barely 30 metres away, Hitler was insisting that Mussolini board the train ahead of him. Mussolini made a remark, but Hartmann was too far away to hear it, and there was laughter. The Italian swung his muscular body up into the doorway. Hartmann saw Schmidt, the interpreter, watching from the fringes of the group. Mussolini fancied he spoke German well enough not to need the services of a translator, and for once Schmidt, normally at the centre of every meeting, looked slightly lost. Hartmann walked towards him. In a quiet voice he said, "Dr. Schmidt?"
Yes, Hartmann?"
"I thought you might like to know I've managed to get hold of the list of Englishmen accompanying Chamberlain." He offered him a scrap of paper with its pencilled scrawl. "I thought you might find it useful." Schmidt seemed surprised. For a moment Hartmann thought he might demand to know why on earth he should be interested in such a thing, but then he accepted it and scanned it with increasing interest.
"Ah, yes, Wilson, I know, of course, and Strang and Malkin, they were both at Gothenburg. Neither speaks German. The other names are not familiar to me."
He glanced over Hartmann's shoulder. Hartmann turned as well. Sauer was bearing down on them. He wore a look of triumph. He called out even before he reached them.
"Dr. Schmidt, excuse me. Did you authorize Herr Hartmann to call Berlin?" "No. What is this?"
"I'm sorry, Sauer. I wasn't aware I needed authorization to make a simple telephone call to the foreign minister."
"Of course you need authorization. All outside communications from a Führer's train must be cleared in advance."
He said to Schmidt, "May I see that paper?" He took it and ran his finger down the names. He frowned and turned it over. Finally he returned it.
"Again and again I find Herr Hartmann's behaviour suspicious," Schmidt said mildly. "I really don't think there's much cause for suspicion here, Strubenführer Sauer. Surely it's useful to know who is coming from London. The fewer of these British officials who speak German, the more translation will be required." "Even so, it is a breach of security."
From the far end of the platform came the noise of metal clashing against metal. The locomotive that had hauled them from Berlin had been turned round in the marshalling yard, and had been backed up to be reconnected to the opposite end of the train. "We ought to board, or we'll be left behind," Hartmann said. Schmidt patted Sauer's arm.
"Well, let's say that I authorize the call retrospectively. Now, is that good enough?"
Sauer looked at Hartmann. He nodded curtly.
"It will have to be."
He turned on heel and strode away.
"What a touchy fellow. I take it he's not a friend of yours."
"Oh, he's not so bad." They walked towards the train. "Sauer is a terrier," thought Hartmann, "and I am his rat." The SS man would never give up. On 3 occasions he'd nearly caught him. In Wilhelmstrasse, on the train, and now here. He would not get away with it a 4th time. The order of the train was now reversed. The Führer's saloon car was at the rear, the sleeper carriages for his entourage at the front. In the centre were the communications wagon and the dining compartment, which was where Hartmann sat with Schmidt as they rolled north towards Munich. The Berliner had produced a large pipe and made a great business out of keeping it going, tamping down the tobacco with his box of matches, sucking at it, lighting it again, producing alarming spouts of flame. He was clearly nervous. Every time one of the Führer's adjutants passed through, he looked up expectantly to see if he was needed. But Hitler and Mussolini appeared to be making themselves understood without him. He seemed put out.
"The Duce's German is good, although not as good as he thinks it is. Let's hope they don't start a war by accident."
He thought this was such a good joke, he whispered some variation of it whenever an adjutant left the dining car.
"No war yet, eh, Hartmann?"
In the middle of the carriage was a table of SS officers, at which Himmler was holding court. Sauer was among them. They were drinking mineral water. From his position, Hartmann could see only the back of the Reichenführer's shaven neck and his protuberant, rather delicate, small pink ears. Plainly he was in excellent spirits. Eruptions of laughter punctuated the monologue. Sauer smiled mechanically with the others, but always his gaze reverted to Hartmann. Schmidt puffed on his pipe.
"Mussolini, I may say, is very easy to translate. Nothing abstract about him. A down-to-earth politician, practical. The same is true of Chamberlain."
"The Führer, I would imagine, is somewhat different." Schmidt hesitated, then leaned across the table.
"A monologue of 20 minutes is not uncommon, sometimes even an hour. And then I have to read it all back in another language. If he's in that mood in Munich, we shall be there for days."
"Perhaps the others won't put up with it."
"Chamberlain certainly gets impatient. He's the only man I ever saw interrupt the Führer. This was at their first meeting at Berchtesgaden. He said, 'If you are so determined to proceed against Czechoslovakia, why did you let me come to Germany in the first place?' Imagine that! The Führer was speechless. There was no love lost there, I tell you."
Behind him the SS men roared with laughter. Schmidt winced, glanced over his shoulder, and settled back in his seat. In a louder voice he said,
"It is such a relief to have you with me, Hartmann. Obviously I shall translate for the Führer and the other leaders, but if you are on hand to help with the rest, it will ease my burden greatly. What languages have you apart from English?"
French, Italian, some Russian."
"Russian? You won't be requiring that."
"Nor Czech." Schmidt raised his eyebrows.
"Quite."
The adjutant re-entered the carriage, and this time he stopped at their table. "Dr. Schmidt, General Keitel is about to make some technical explanations to Duce. The Führer wants you to be present."
"Of course."
Schmidt quickly knocked the contents of his pipe into the ashtray. In his anxiety he spilled ash across the table.
"Sorry, Hartmann."
He stood and buttoned his double-breasted jacket and tugged it down over his broad stomach. He jammed the pipe into his pocket.
"Do I smell of smoke?"
he asked the adjutant. To Hartmann he said,
"If he smells smoke, he'll send you out of the room."
He pulled out a tin of peppermints and popped a couple into his mouth.
"I should see you later."
After he had gone, Hartmann felt suddenly vulnerable, like a boy who'd escaped being bullied only because he'd stayed close to his teacher. He rose and made his way towards the front of the carriage. As he passed the SS table, Sauer called out,
"Hartmann, aren't you going to salute the Reichsführer?"
Hartmann was aware of a sudden silence. He stopped, turned, clicked his heels, and raised his arm.
"Heil Hitler!"
Himmler's watery eyes peered up at him from behind his rimless spectacles. The top half of his face was very smooth and pale, but around his lips and his weak chin there was already a 5 o'clock shadow. He raised his arm slowly. He smiled.
"Don't worry about it, my dear fellow."
He flicked his fingers dismissively and lowered his arm. As Hartmann reached the end of a dining car, he heard another outbreak of laughter behind him. He guessed he must be the subject of some joke. He felt his face begin to burn with shame. How much he loathed them. He pulled the door open violently and strode through the sleeper carriage. When he reached the front coach, he tried the handle of the toilet door. Locked. He put his ear to it and listened, but he could hear nothing. He lowered the nearby window and leaned out to get some air. The landscape was flat and monotonous, the fields brown and bare after the harvest. He turned his head into the onrushing air. The cold wind steadied his nerves. In the distance he could see factory chimneys. He guessed they must be nearing Munich. The toilet door opened. One of the Wehrmacht signal officers emerged. They exchanged nods. Hartmann went inside and drew the bolt. The cubicle stank of human waste. Sodden yellow-stained paper was strewn across the floor. The smell seemed to catch in the back of his throat. He bent over the toilet bowl and retched. His face in the mirror when he stared into it was cadaverous, hollow-eyed. He splashed himself with water, then lowered himself on his haunches and pulled away the panelling beneath the basin. His fingers felt around the pipework, the wall, the underside of the sink. Someone tried the toilet door. He couldn't find the gun. He panicked. He reached in further, touched it, and pulled it out. Now the door handle was being rattled vigorously. "All right, I'm finished." He slipped the Walther into his inside pocket, and to cover the sound he made pushing the panel back into position, he flushed the toilet again. He half expected to find Sauer in the corridor waiting to arrest him. Instead, it was one of the Italian delegation in pale grey fascist uniform. Hartmann returned his salute and lurched off down the passage. Inside his compartment he slid the door shut and hauled down his suitcase. He sat on the edge of the bottom bunk, rested it on his knees, and opened it. The document was still inside. He hung his head in relief. He felt his body sway sideways. There was a scrape of metal, a slight shuddering beneath his feet. He looked up. Sunshine was glinting on the back of houses and apartment buildings. Swastikas hung from some of the windows. They were coming into Munich. It was the time of the Oktoberfest, the annual fun fair and folk festival, celebrated in these days of national unity under the official slogan, "Proud City, Cheerful Country." And now, behold, there was another reason to be joyful. With only a few hours' notice, the party was calling on everyone to welcome the Führer and his distinguished foreign guests. "Citizens of Munich, get out on the streets, starting 10:30 a.m. Schools had been closed and workers had been given time off. In the station, posters announced the various hotels where the delegations would be staying and the routes along which leaders would travel. The moment he stepped off the train, Hartmann could hear the crowd outside the station and the sound of a band playing. Goering was waiting on the platform wearing some elaborate black uniform, presumably of his own design, with broad white piping on the trouser legs and diamond-shaped lapels. Hartmann inwardly cringed at the vulgarity. He waited until the dictators and their entourages had descended from the train and passed him, Mussolini's broad face lit up by a smile, like a child's drawing of the sun. Then he followed them across the station concourse. When they emerged into the cobbled square of Bahnhofplatz, the ovation was deafening. It was a hot day, sticky with humidity. People were lining the pavements and cramming the windows of the neighbouring post office building. Hundreds of young children were waving swastika flags. An SS honour guard in white gloves and black coal-scuttle helmets shouldered their rifles. A military band struck up the Italian national anthem. And yet what riveted Hartmann's attention most was the grimness of Hitler's expression. He stood through the anthems and inspected the troops as if this flummery was the very last thing he wanted. Only when two little girls in white dresses were allowed to pass through the line of police and present him and the Duce with flowers did he manage a smile. But as soon as he'd given his bouquet to an aide and climbed into his open-topped Mercedes, his expression darkened. Mussolini, still grinning, settled down beside him, while Goering, Himmler, Keitel, Czarno and the other bigwigs piled into the cars behind. The convoy pulled into the Beerstrasse, and from the street came the sound of more cheering. The crowd began to disperse. Hartmann looked round. Beneath the colonnades of the station, a harassed official of the Foreign Ministry was explaining the day's protocol to those who had been left behind. The Führer and the Duce, he announced, reading from a sheet of paper, were presently on their way to the Prince Karl Palais, where the Italians would be staying. While the Duce refreshed himself, the Führer would return by motorcade to the Führerbau to prepare for the conference. The rest of the German delegation should make their way there immediately. For those who desired transport, cars were waiting. Otherwise it was only a short walk. Someone asked where they would be spending the night. The official looked up from his paper and shrugged. He did not know as yet. Perhaps the Bayerischer Hof. Hotel rooms were hard to come by during the Oktoberfest. The whole thing seemed slightly chaotic. Hartmann chose to walk. He had always been careful over the past few years to avoid this part of Munich. It was only a 10-minute stroll from the station, along a pleasant tree-lined street, past the old botanical gardens, a girls' school, some academic buildings, then the huge open space of Königsplatz. In his mind he'd preferred to preserve it as he remembered it from that summer, a red and grey checked blanket spread beneath the trees, Lena in a white dress with brown bare ankles, a picnic, Hugh reading, the scent of fresh-cut grass drying in the sun. All gone. The immensity of the vista stopped him in his tracks. He set down the suitcase in a shock. It was worse than he'd anticipated, worse even than in the newsreels. The park had been eradicated to provide a vast parade ground to stage the spectacles of the Third Reich. In place of grass were tens of thousands of granite slabs. The trees had become metal flagpoles. From two hung swastikas more than 40 metres high. On either side of him was a temple of honour, supported by pillars of yellow limestone, each containing 8 bronze sarcophagi, where the martyrs of the beer hall putsch were now interred. Eternal flames flickered in the hot sunshine, guarded by a pair of SS men standing inhumanly still, their faces sheened with sweat. Beyond the temple to his left was the hideous, brutalist facade of the Nazi Party administration building. Beyond the temple to his right, its near-identical twin, the Führerbau. All was functional, white and grey and black, straight lines, sharp edges. Even the neoclassical columns of the temples were square. Outside the Führerbau he could see activity, cars drawing up, guards, flashbulbs, milling crowds. Hartmann saluted the martyred dead, as one was obliged by law to do. It was dangerous to disobey. One never knew who might be watching. He picked up his suitcase and walked towards the conference. The Prime Minister had worked throughout the flight, and now he was finished. He closed the census report listing every county of the Czech Republic and the exact proportion of its population that was German-speaking, and replaced it in his dispatch case. He screwed the cap back on his fountain pen and returned it to his inside pocket. Then he lifted the red box from his knees and handed it to Leggett, who was waiting in the aisle. "Thank you, Hugh, Prime Minister." He carried the dispatch box to the back of the plane, locked it and stowed it in the luggage rack, then fastened his seatbelt. From the pressure in his ears he guessed they must be descending. All conversation in the cabin had ceased. Each man was peering out of his window, alone with his thoughts. The plane jolted and shuddered in the clouds. For a long time they seemed to be diving towards the bottom of a rough sea. It was easy to imagine the vibrations tearing off an engine or a wing. But at last they dropped out of the base of cloud, and the shaking stopped. A drab green-olive landscape appeared beneath them, scored by the clear white line of an autobahn, running as straight as a Roman road between conifer forests and across hills and plains. Leggett pressed his face to the glass. It was the first time he'd seen Germany in 6 years. For his Foreign Office entrance examination, he'd been required to translate Hauff into English and J.S. Mill into German. He'd accomplished both tasks with time to spare, yet the country itself remained a mystery to him. They were losing height fast. He had to pinch his nose and swallow hard. The plane banked. In the distance he saw the factory chimneys and church spires of what he presumed must be Munich. They straightened, flew on for a minute or two, passed low above a field dotted with brown cattle. A hedge flashed past. There was a rush of grass, and then, once, twice, 3 times, they bounced along the ground and braked so hard he felt he was pitched forward against the seat in front. The Lockheed skidded over the airfield, past terminal buildings that looked bigger than at Heston, 2 or 3 stories, with crowds of people packed along the terraces and on the roof. Swastika banners hung from the parapet and fluttered from flagpoles alongside the Union Jack and the French tricolour. Leggett thought of Wigram. He was glad he was not alive to see it. The Prime Minister's plane came to a stop at Oberweisenfeld Airport at 11:35 a.m. The engines whined and died. Inside the cabin, after 3 hours of flight, the silence was noise in itself. Commander Robinson emerged from the cockpit, bent to have a word with the Prime Minister and Wilson, then walked past Leggett to the back of the plane. He unlocked the door and lowered the steps. Leggett felt a blast of warm air and heard German voices. Wilson rose from his seat. "Gentlemen, we should let the Prime Minister disembark first." He helped Chamberlain on with his overcoat and gave him his hat. The Prime Minister came down the slope of the aisle, grabbing the headrests of the seats to steady himself. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw jutting, fixed, as if biting down on something. Wilson followed him and waited beside Leggett while the Prime Minister descended to the concrete apron. He bent to peer out of a window. "My spies tell me you went to see Alexander Cadogan last night," he said quietly without turning round. "Oh, God," he added quickly, "there's Ribbentrop." He ducked through the door after Chamberlain. Behind him, Strang, Malkin, Ashton, Watkin and Dunglass were lining up to disembark. Leggett waited until they passed. Wilson's remark had unsettled him. What did it mean? He wasn't sure. Perhaps Cleverly had said something to him. He stood and put on his coat and hat, reached up to the rack and took down the Prime Minister's red boxes. As he emerged from the plane, a military band started playing God Save the King, and he had to stand awkwardly to attention on the steps. Once they'd finished that, and just as he was about to move, they embarked on Deutschland über alles. His eyes wandered across the crowded airfield in search of Hartmann. Past the newsreel cameraman and the photographers, the official reception, the SS Honour Guard, a dozen big Mercedes limousines with swastika pennants drawn up side by side. He couldn't see him. He wondered if he'd changed much. The music ended to loud applause from the crowds in the terminal. A chant of "Chamberlain! Chamberlain!" drifted over the concrete. Ribbentrop gestured to the Prime Minister, and the two men walked across the apron to inspect the line of soldiers. At the foot of the steps, an SS officer with a clipboard asked Leggett for his name. He scanned the list. "Ah, yes, you replaced Herr Sears." He placed a small tick beside it. "You're assigned to the 4th car," he said in German, "with Herr Ashton Watkin. Your luggage will be taken to the hotel. Please?" He tried to take the red boxes. "No, thank you. I need to keep these." There was a brief tug of war, until finally the German let go. The Mercedes was open-topped. Ashton Watkin was already seated in the back. He wore a heavy overcoat with an astrakhan collar. He was perspiring profusely in the heat. "What an absolute beast!" he murmured as the SS man moved away. He turned his hooded eyes on Leggett. Leggett knew him by reputation only, the most brilliant classicist of his year at Oxford, even though he'd left without taking a degree. A Japanese scholar, the husband of a ballerina, childless, a poet, a novelist, whose lurid bestseller, Kimono, had caused such resentment in Tokyo that he had to be recalled. And now, an expert on the economy of the Sudetenland. "The PM's hating every minute of this," Leggett said. Chamberlain was hurrying through a review of the SS formation. He barely bothered to glance at the young men in their black uniforms. He also ignored Ribbentrop, whom he detested. When he realised he was supposed to share the lead car with the German foreign minister, he looked around helplessly for Wilson, but there was no escape. The two men settled into the open Mercedes, and the cortege moved off, slowly passing along the length of the airport terminal in order that the crowds could cheer Chamberlain, who politely raised his hat in acknowledgment. At the airport gate, they turned south towards Munich. Hartmann had booked their tickets during Hillary term, 1932. They'd just been to the Cotswolds to visit Leggett's mother in her cottage in Stone-the-Wold. She hated all Huns on principle. Paul she had adored. When they got back to Balliol that Sunday night, Hartmann had said, "My dear Hugh, as soon as finals are over, allow me to show you some proper countryside for a change, something that is not merely pretty." He had a girlfriend who lived in Bavaria. They could meet up with her. It had never occurred to either of them that while life went on in Oxford in the same old way, Hindenburg might dissolve the Reichstag and provoke a general election. They'd arrived in Munich on the same summer's day that Hitler had addressed a giant rally outside the city, and however much they'd tried to ignore politics and get on with their vacation, there had been no escape, not even in the smallest town. Leggett remembered a blur of marches and countermarches, the Storm Battalion versus the Iron Front, demonstrations outside buildings and arguments in cafes, Nazi posters, Hitler over Germany, Germany awake. They were put up by the brown shirts during the day and torn down by the leftists overnight. A meeting in a park that had ended in a cavalry chase by the mounted police. When Lena had suggested they go and stand outside Hitler's apartment and had shouted abuse when he appeared, they'd been lucky not to be beaten up themselves. It was a long way from Hof and J.S. Mill. Translate into German. The administration of a joint stock association is, in the main, administration by hired servants. He stared out of the car. All the way into the centre of the town, the citizens of Munich lined the streets, so that the motorcade seemed to travel behind a bow wave of applause for the Prime Minister, borne along by a surging river of red, white and black flags. Occasionally, when they swerved to take a corner, Leggett glimpsed him in the front car, leaning out slightly, his hat permanently in his hand, circling it in the direction of the crowds. Hundreds of arms rose in the fascist salute. 10 minutes after leaving the airfield, the convoy rounded the square and drew to a halt outside the Regina Palace Hotel. A huge swastika dangled above the portico. Beneath it stood the British ambassador, Henderson, and Ivan Kirkpatrick, head of Chancery at the Berlin Embassy. Ashton Watkin let out his breath. "I think I could rather get used to that. Couldn't you?" He heaved his ungainly body out of the Mercedes. Ribbentrop was already being driven away. In the public gardens opposite the hotel, the crowd was 8 or 10 deep, held back by a line of brown shirts. They cheered. The Prime Minister waved. More flashes from the cameras. Henderson ushered him inside. Leggett, a red box in either hand, walked quickly after them. The large galleried lobby looked as if it hadn't changed much since the Kaiser's day. A stained-glass ceiling, a parquet floor covered in Persian rugs, a plethora of potted palms and armchairs. Several dozen mostly elderly guests were gawping at the sight of Chamberlain. He was standing close to the reception desk in a huddle with Henderson, Kirkpatrick and Wilson. Leggett stopped and waited nearby, unsure whether or not to approach them. Suddenly all 4 turned to look at him. He had the sensation that he was under discussion. A moment later, Wilson was heading across the foyer towards him. The Führerbau was barely a year old, the work of Hitler's favourite architect, the late Professor Troost, so brand new that the white stone seemed to sparkle in the morning light. On the other side of the twin porticos hung giant flags. The German and the Italian flanked the southern entrance, the British and the French the northern. Above the doors were bronze eagles, wings outstretched, swastikas in their talons. Red carpets had been run out from both sets of doors, down the steps and across the pavement to the curb. Only the northern entrance was in use. Here an 18-man honour guard stood with their rifles presented, alongside a drummer and a bugler. Hartmann passed them unchallenged, climbed the steps, and went inside. Its function was not entirely clear. It was not a government building or a party headquarters. Rather, it was kind of a monarch's court, for the enlightenment and entertainment of the emperor's guests. The interior was clad entirely in marble, a dull plum colour for the floors and the 2 grand staircases, greyish-white for the walls and pillars, although on the upper level the effect of the lighting was to make the stone glow golden. The foyer was crowded with dark suits and uniforms. An anticipatory buzz animated the air, as if a gala performance was about to begin. He spotted a few faces he recognised from the newspapers, a couple of Gauleiters, and Rudolf Hess, the Führer's deputy, with his usual vaguely dreamy expression. He gave his name to the SS guards and was nodded through. Straight ahead of him was the northern staircase. To his right, the lobby opened to a long semicircular cloakroom with 2 queues. He spotted a gentleman's lavatory and diverted his course towards that. He locked himself into a cubicle, opened his suitcase, took out the document, unbuttoned his shirt, and thrust it under his vest. Then he did up his buttons, sat on the toilet, and examined his hands. They were strange to him, cold and shaking slightly. He rubbed them together vigorously, breathed on them, then flushed the lavatory and went back into the cloakroom. He laid his hat, coat and suitcase on the counter and checked them in. He climbed the northern staircase to the first-floor gallery. He was starting to understand the layout of the building. Above the first gallery was a second, above that an opaque white glass ceiling flooding the whole place with natural light. It was perfectly symmetrical and logical, impressive in fact. Waiters passed him carrying trays of food and bottles of beer. For want of a better idea, he followed them. Through the nearest of 3 open doors he saw a large salon with a buffet lunch laid out on white tablecloths. Further along the wide corridor that ran the length of the front of the building was a gallery with armchairs and low tables. Beyond that an SS sentry stood guard in the corridor. He was turning away anyone who tried to approach. Hartmann guessed that must be the room where Hitler was waiting. "Hartmann!" He swung round to see von Weizsäcker in the same room as the buffet lunch. He was standing beside the window talking to Schmidt. He beckoned to Hartmann to join them. The room was panelled in dark wood, with carved reliefs of various joyless rural activities. A few adjutants stood around, holding whispered conversations. Each time someone came in, they stiffened, and then relaxed when they saw it wasn't Hitler. "Schmidt's just been telling me of your encounter on the Führer's train with Sturmbannführer Sauer." Yes, he seems to have got it into his head I'm an unreliable element." "To Sauer we are all unreliable elements." State Secretary laughed, then stopped abruptly. "Seriously, Hartmann, try not to antagonize him any further. He has the ear of a minister, and he is capable of creating all sorts of trouble." "I'll do my best." "Will you? I worry about your best. When this is over, I think perhaps it might be prudent to post you overseas somewhere. Washington, perhaps." Schmidt said, "How about Australia?" Weizsäcker laughed again. "An excellent suggestion. Even party comrade Sauer can't follow you across the Pacific Ocean." From beneath the window came a sound of cheering. The three men looked down into the street. An open Mercedes had just drawn up. Sitting very straight in the back was the British Prime Minister. Next to him was a slight and furtive-looking figure Hartmann didn't recognise. "And so it begins," said Weizsäcker. "Who is that with Chamberlain?" "Sir Horace Wilson. The Führer can't abide him either." More cars were pulling up behind the Prime Minister's. Hartmann tried to look further along the street, but his view was obscured. "Isn't the Führer going to go outside and meet him?" "I doubt it. The only place the Führer wishes to see that particular old gentleman is in his grave." Chamberlain climbed out of the car, followed by Wilson. As he set foot on the red carpet, there was a drum roll and a fanfare. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgment, then passed out of sight. The Mercedes pulled away. Almost immediately the crowd started cheering again. Another open-top limousine drew up to take its place. In the back of this were Goering and the French Prime Minister, Daladier. Even at a distance one could sense Daladier's unease. He was hunched down in the car as though he could pretend he wasn't really there. Goering, in contrast, looked delighted. Somehow, since leaving the railway station, he'd managed to change into a new uniform. This one was snow-white. It bulged and strained to contain the rolls of his fat. Beside him, Hartmann heard Weizsäcker suppress a snort of derision. "What on earth is he wearing now?" Hartmann said, "Perhaps he wanted to make Monsieur Daladier feel at home by dressing as the Michelin Man." Weizsäcker wagged his finger at him. "Now that's exactly the sort of remark I was warning you against." "State Secretary," said Schmidt. He nodded to the doorway where Chamberlain had appeared. "Your Excellency." Weizsäcker moved smoothly across the floor with both hands extended. The Prime Minister was a smaller figure than Hartmann had expected, round-shouldered with a tiny head, bushy grey eyebrows and moustache, and slightly protruding teeth. He was wearing a charcoal pinstriped suit and a watch chain across his waistcoat. The delegation filing in after him were equally unprepossessing. Hartmann examined each face as it appeared. This one lugubrious, this avuncular, this austere, another chinless. The hopelessness of his task briefly overwhelmed him. Of Legate there was no sign. The room was starting to fill. Goering came in through the central door with Daladier and his entourage. Hartmann had read that the French Prime Minister, on account of his stocky muscular frame, was known in Paris as the Bull of Vaucluse. Now his great block of a head was down, and his eyes flickered warily left and right as he was led towards the buffet table. Chamberlain went over to meet him and gave a greeting in his schoolboy French, bidding welcome and hoping that he'd had a pleasant voyage. Goering was filling a plate for himself with a great pile of cold meats, cheeses, pickles, vol au vents. While all eyes were on the Prime Minister's, Hartmann took his chance to slip away. He walked across the gallery and peered over the stone balustrade to the staircase and the crowded foyer below. He descended to the ground floor and looked into the cloakroom, then into the lavatory. Then he went outside, past the drummer and the bugler, and down the red carpet onto the pavement. He even put his hands on his hips and surveyed the crowd. It was no use. Legate was nowhere. The spectators started to applaud again. He looked along the street to see a Mercedes approaching. In the back, their profiles as haughty as those of Roman emperors, were Mussolini and Ciano. A guard opened their door for them, and they stepped gracefully onto the pavement, tugging down the jackets of their pale grey uniforms. A gust of wind fluttered the flags. The army musicians played their fanfare. The Italians strutted into the building. 2 more cars with their uniformed entourage drew up behind. He waited for perhaps half a minute, and then followed them back inside. They were standing in the lobby, being greeted by Ribbentrop, while behind them, descending the red marble staircase, almost shyly as it seemed to Hartmann, bare-headed and alone, was Hitler. He was wearing a creased brown, double-breasted party jacket with a swastika armband and a pair of black trousers and scuffed black shoes. He stood on the landing halfway down the stairs, his hands clasped modestly in front of him, waiting for Mussolini to take notice of him. When the Führer's presence was finally pointed out by Ribbentrop, the Duce threw up his hands in a show of delight, and swiftly mounted the steps to grasp Hitler's hand. The 2 dictators turned and walked up to the first floor, trailing their retinues. Hartmann inserted himself at the back. For the next few minutes he acted as interpreter, facilitating some stilted small talk about their recent experiences of flying. This was between General Keitel and the British diplomat Strang. All the while he was keeping an eye on the room and its entrances. He noticed many things in rapid sequence. The way Chamberlain and Daladier hastened over to greet the fascist leaders. The way whenever Mussolini moved, Hitler moved with him, as if he was nervous of being left on his own in such a large gathering of strangers. He watched Ribbentrop conferring with Ciano, 2 arrogant, handsome peacocks together. And behind Ribbentrop he saw Sturmbannführer Sauer, who immediately locked eyes on his. Keitel had finished speaking and was waiting for him to translate. He made an effort to remember what he'd just said. General Keitel was recalling the weather when he flew back to Berlin after your last meeting at Göttesberg. It was evening, and his plane had to make detours around dozens of lightning storms. He says it was an incomparable spectacle at a height of 3,000 meters. It's curious he should say that, replied Strang, because, tell him, we also had a difficult experience. There was a stir of activity round one of the entrances. Hitler, whose boredom and unease had become increasingly evident, was leaving. The instant the Führer exited the room, all the Germans moved quickly to follow him. Hartmann walked with Keitel. They went into the corridor and turned right. He was not sure what he was supposed to do. He was conscious of Sauer and the group behind, and of Ribbentrop with him. They passed the long gallery where various lounging SS officers jumped to their feet and saluted as Hitler went by. At the entrance to his office he halted. The effect was comic, like a pile-up of traffic. He wore a look of intense impatience. "We shall talk in here," he said to Ribbentrop in his harsh voice. "Leaders and one adviser only." His dull blue eyes swept around his entourage. Hartmann, who was standing quite close to him, felt himself briefly come under the heat of his scrutiny. The gaze moved on, stopped, and then returned to him. "I need to borrow a watch. Lend me yours, please." He held out his hand. Hartmann stared at him, momentarily paralyzed. Hitler turned to the others. "He thinks he won't get it back. Ha ha!" There was a roar of laughter. "Yes, my Führer." Hartmann's fingers were clumsy as he unfastened the watch and handed it over. He was rewarded with a nod. "Good. Let us get this business started." He went into his office. Ribbentrop went after him. Schmidt turned in the doorway. "Hartmann, will you go and tell the others we're ready to begin?" Hartmann walked back towards the reception room. He rubbed the pale skin on his left wrist where he had worn his watch night and day for the past 8 years. It was odd to be without it, and now that man had it. He felt dangerously detached from what was happening, as if he were wandering through a dream. Behind the buffet table, Chamberlain was talking to Mussolini again. As he approached, Hartmann caught the words, "A good day's fishing?" Mussolini nodded politely, bored. Hartmann said in English, "Excuse me for interrupting, Your Excellencies. The Führer would like to invite you to join him in his study to begin the talks. He suggests leaders and one adviser only." Mussolini looked round for Ciano, saw him and snapped his fingers. Ciano came to heel immediately. Chamberlain called to Wilson, "Horace, we're going in." Daladier, watching from a short distance away, turned his melancholy eyes on Hartmann. "Nous comment quand?" He was standing with a group of French officials. Hartmann recognized the ambassador, Francois Poncet. Daladier glanced about him and frowned.
"Oi, Alexis!"
Nobody seemed to know. Francois Ponce volunteered to go and find him. He hurried out of the room. Daladier looked at Hartmann and shrugged. Occasionally one lost the head of one's foreign ministry. What was one to do? Chamberlain said, "I don't think we should keep Herr Hitler waiting." He turned to the door. After a brief hesitation, the French and Italian delegations followed him. When he reached the corridor, he stopped.
Which is the way?"
he said to Hartmann. "Oh, please follow me, Your Excellency." He led them along the long gallery where the Germans were standing watching. How drab the British and French looked in their office suits, crumpled after their long journeys, compared to the uniforms of the SS and the Italian fascists. How unvirile, how dowdy, and outnumbered. At the entrance to the Führer's study, Hartmann stood aside to let them enter. Chamberlain first, then Mussolini and Daladier, then Ciano and Wilson. The head of the French Foreign Ministry, Legare, was still missing. Hartmann hesitated before he went into the room. He had an impression of largeness, of dark wood and masculinity. A huge globe, a floor-to-ceiling bookcase, and a desk at one end. A heavy table in the centre, and at the opposite end, drawn up in a semicircle around a brick and stone fireplace, a group of wood and wicker armchairs and a sofa. A portrait of Bismarck hung above the chimney-piece. Already seated in the armchair furthest to the left was Hitler, with Schmidt beside him. He indicated with a wave that his guests could sit where they pleased. There was something off-hand about the gesture, as if it was all the same to him. Chamberlain claimed the armchair closest to the Führer. Wilson sat to his right. The Italians took the sofa which faced the fireplace. Ribbentrop and Daladier completed the group, leaving an empty chair for Legare. As he bent to speak quietly to Ribbentrop, Hartmann noticed his watch lying on the low table in front of Hitler.
"Oh, forgive me, Herr Minister, but Monsieur Legare is not yet ready."
Hitler, shifting in his chair with impatience, must have overheard him. He made a dismissive gesture.
"Let us start in any case. He can join us later." "I can't possibly begin without him. Legare knows all the details. I know nothing."
Chamberlain sighed and folded his arms. Schmidt translated the statement into German. Abruptly Hitler leaned forwards and picked up Hartmann's watch. He studied it ostentatiously for a few seconds.
"Keitel!"
The general waiting by the door hastened to his side. Hitler whispered in his ear. Keitel nodded and left the room. The others stared at Hitler, unsure what was happening. Ribbentrop said to Hartmann, "Go and see if you can find him." Hartmann went out into the corridor, just in time to see Legare hurrying into view. He was a small man in a black suit with a jet-black moustache and widow's peak. His face was pink from the exertion of running. He looked like a figure made of icing on the top of a wedding cake.
"Oh, scuse, mille, scuse!"
He darted into the Führer's study. Hartmann had a brief glimpse of the four leaders and their advisers, together with Schmidt, seated as still as figures in a photograph, before the SS guard closed the door.